August the 26th, 2014. It was 9 years ago that I first publicly spoke about sex addiction. I'd been a sex addiction therapist or a CSAT for a couple of years, I think, but it still wasn't a commonly talked about addiction. It was still kind of on the quiet, if you like. Well, certainly at least for me in my practice and the work that I was doing. It was my first radio interview on the topic, and honestly, I was terrified. If I can only tell you just how nervous I was. It was so fascinating to get this out of the archives and listen back this week. It was such a new phenomenon back then. If you listen to the interview, and I really hope you do, it was quite an uncomfortable topic for the interviewers. There were a few awkward jokes about sex. It's amazing to listen to. The interviewers weren't used to talking about this kind of material. It's the first time they'd had this conversation about sex so publicly, certainly sex addiction. It was a brilliant interview. But it's funny because, I really got used to that. And I remember back then, certainly, when I used to tell people what I did for work, I always had such an awkward, odd silence. I remember sometimes people would say, "Is that a real thing?" And other people would say, "God, I wish I had that." It was so peculiar how people would respond to hearing that I worked with sex addiction. I would say we're not there yet, but man, we have come so much further in the treatment and the understanding of sex and porn addiction. This is still relevant to listen to, and I really hope that you take the time and you listen to it. It's such an interesting and cool interview. I'm so glad that I've continued in my journey in the understanding and the treatment of sex and porn addiction, and in the treatment of intimacy disorders in general. It's been such a cool experience, and I really hope that you enjoy listening to this as much as I did listening to it almost 10 years later. Really, it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
So today we get to talk recovery about sex addiction with Calgary sex addiction therapist Suzie LeBrock. Hi, Suzie. Welcome to Talk Recovery. Are you there?
I am here, yes. Thank you. Hi. Nice to
Oh, where's the accent from? Do they speak like that in Calgary?
No, my accent's from the UK.
Nice. Oh, it's so good. A therapist with an accent. That just totally makes my day. Okay, so let's talk about sex addiction. I have lots of questions. First of all, what is the actual definition of sex addiction? Do you have one?
Well, I have to say, Giuseppe, before I start, that was quite a lead-in.
I'm really totally.
I'm really not sure that I can top that right now.
Do you want me to send you pictures of the photo album?
Yeah, no, I don't know that I do, actually. Sex addiction is, like any other addiction, it is a compulsive acting out of sexual behavior. It's related largely to trauma and high stress situations. Addiction in its various forms, particularly sex addiction, becomes a solution to anxiety and stress. So it's a compulsive sexual acting out as a way of reducing stress and essentially dealing with pain and activating dopamine so that a person feels better when they're struggling with a number of different emotions.
Interesting. That explains my last boyfriend. No, just kidding. Just totally joking. I'm joking. That's joking. I don't even have sex anymore. That causes babies. Anyways, so is there differences between having a high sex drive, being hypersexual, and being an actual sex addict?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny because most people, when you talk about sex addiction, a lot of people say, well, I wish I had that.
I know. It's kind of like the lottery, right? Like,
but it is, I mean, essentially it is very, very different. Sex addiction is essentially about activating dopamine and feeling better about oneself. It's related to high stress, a way of dealing with anxiety and trauma. Sex is a normal part of our lives. It's a normal part of human existence. Sex addiction goes beyond that, and it becomes a compulsive behavior that's about reducing stress. It's about reducing anxiety. It's about feeling better. And more often than not, you find that people don't enjoy sexual experiences. They don't enjoy the acting out. There is no pleasure related to it. It's gone beyond that. Like drinking, an alcoholic drinks alcohol to metabolize dopamine. And in that respect, sexual acting out is about the same thing. So there's no real pleasure gained in it. It's related to so much shame, a lot of self-disgust. It's just a very destructive and traumatic way of living.
So originally, when someone is developing an addiction, or however you want to say that, it is about pleasure. It's like, that's going to make me feel good. I'm going to do that. That'll be a nice escape. It's been a stressful day, whatever. Mm-hmm. But then I guess what happens when it crosses that line is when you begin to associate that person or that act with pain instead of pleasure. But the thing is that you still can't stop yourself from doing what's going to cause you pain. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah. We all have an arousal template. As children mature, they develop an arousal template, and that comes from family messages, early sexual experiences, church influences, childhood experiences, magazines, TV, movies. And that arousal template is something that we then use as a way of becoming aroused and achieving, sexual pleasure. When somebody overuses that arousal template, objects, scenarios, situations become eroticized. And so the person can't achieve sexual arousal in a normal manner. Their brain becomes saturated with sex hormones and dopamine. So a normal sexual experience isn't enjoyable. Everything becomes so eroticized that they have to, consistently go out of the comfort zone, take higher risk activities, and do higher risk things to achieve arousal and ultimately orgasm. So the arousal template gets changed and it becomes higher and higher. So normal sexual encounters become fruitless, I guess, in that respect.
That sounds really hopeless. It's like, so I'm imagining, and I know it's not hopeless, but I'm imagining that, okay, say if you can only have an orgasm if you're at this like really high risk situation, and this is like, you keep having to put yourself in higher risk situations all the time. How do you ever learn how to have like a real intimacy in a relationship, or to have an orgasm at just normal sex, just a loving sexual experience sort of thing, that would ever be enough for you? Like,
the word hopeless is great, and I would think that the majority of people that I deal with and the groups that I run with sex addicts, hopeless is a word that comes up all the time. It's difficult because, like eating, sex is so normal. However, for a sex addict, it's become pathological. It's become problematic. So to balance that out and to learn how to have a healthy sexual relationship, often people have to abstain from any form of sexual activity, be that even if they're in a committed relationship. They may have to have an abstinence contract. They may have to stop putting themselves in situations or scenarios that are eroticized. And so to reduce that arousal template so that it starts to become normal. And then they have to learn how to have, healthy sexual relationships again. And that can take a really long time. The shame related to not being able to have a healthy sexual relationship, like, an anorexic that can't have a healthy relationship with food, is great. It's very challenging because we look around and the majority of people seem to be able to do it okay. So often for people it's about stopping any form of sexual encounters with self, with somebody else, with their partner, husband, wife, until the arousal template is brought down, and then they can start to learn how to have a healthy sexual relationship. And for a lot of these people, healthy sexual relationship isn't something that they understand in any way.
Yeah, I think that is key, really. And then even I know in some 12-step groups, like I'm hearing more about the 12-step group, Sex, Love, Addicts Anonymous. Mm-hmm. And I hear about more and more people that are going there actually just to learn how to have a healthy relationship. Like, what are the general guidelines? Like, because you go out and to be an adult or whatever, and you can do what you want, right? But then you sort of realize that if you do everything you want to do, then it becomes this excess thing and it causes you a lot of pain. So to learn how to have healthy boundaries and healthy guidelines and not knowing what those are. So a lot of people will go to 12-step groups to figure out what's healthy, what's everyone else doing. So I think that they are helpful in that way. I know in those programs, like they have different forms of abstinence. So maybe for one person it might be pornography, for another person it might be driving by your ex's house. Oh, I didn't drive by my ex's house, for a month or whatever, right? Or contacting your ex or that sort of thing. So sometimes is that sort of what you do in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to kind of segue into that. We call it the 3-circle sort of method. And you have inner circle behavior. Now, inner circle behavior is your sexual acting out behavior. So that may be pornography and masturbation. It may be random hookups. It may be using prostitutes. It may be using drugs or alcohol. Then you have your second circle, which is your kind of slippery slope, your slippery behavior. For some people, it's as easy or it's as simple as not being able to use a smartphone. It may be not spending time in Walmart. It may be not going on the internet. So not actually the pornography piece or searching on hookup sites is the inner circle behavior, the acting out. The Googling anything could be the second circle behavior. And then your third circle is your recovery sexual behavior, so what's healthy for you. What we often find is that the second circle, the slippery circle, is where people really get into trouble. For example, watching a movie like American Pie. It's not pornographic. Well, I mean, it kind of, some of the scenes could border on that, but it's not seen as a pornographic movie. But for some of these folks, it's become very eroticized, and simply watching something like that could lead them into sexual acting out. Mm-hmm. So we would put certain things in that where they have to be hypervigilant about, did I spend too long standing in Walmart looking at the women walking in the women's underwear section? Or did I spend, too long when I'm walking down the street to get my lunch, peering at guys that are, coming around? And essentially, what am I going to do with that behavior when I'm on my own? What am I going to do when I get back from lunch and I've just spent 45 minutes staring at people, voyeuristically watching people in the streets? Am I going to go back to my office, watch a pornographic movie and masturbate?
Gotcha.
Am I going to obsess and, compulsively think about that until I go home, and then on my way home I'm going to go and pick up a movie and, act out when I get home?
It seems like I can't remember what that's called. Like the before the sex act or whatever, like the actual orgasm is very short, but it's like the whole process of like leading up to that. Oh, foreplay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I haven't had that in a long time. Foreplay. Sorry. Oh my gosh. It's a very interesting topic to talk about. And, I was raised a Christian and whatever. So for me, it feels kind of awkward. I'm going to admit. So if I make dumb jokes, please don't Please don't be offended. I'm just trying to cope.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, it is. It's a very awkward thing to talk about. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons why people struggle so much coming forward.
It's true, and we want to talk more about that, but we have to go to our first song. Will you stay on the line? And Giuseppe and Darren have more questions for you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, on the line today with sex therapist Suzie LeBrock and your own Frances Stone, making it awkward on herself. Love it.
She needs to go for a smoke.
I don't smoke.
You're listening to Talk Recovery. We're back more with sex addiction, recovery from it, and what that all looks like. Right off the bat here from Vancouver on the air with Suzie LeBrock, a sex addiction therapist. Now, I mean, we've got into it a little bit of a description around it, kind of having a laugh around that being the ideal addiction to get into, if you could. But then it opens up this whole gateway of, criminal levels of where this addiction can take you. From, I mean, is this where the arousal levels that you were talking about, Suzie, is this where, men that are attracted to young girls comes into play? Like, is this still sex addiction, or is this beyond?
You know what? I think it's beyond. Sex offending is really very different to sex addiction. That's not to say that sex offenders struggle with sex addiction, and that's not to say that sex addicts can't offend. But it's quite different, and I think that's where people get a little confused. People find it quite difficult, to hear about sex addicts, because I think their immediate reaction is that somebody's offending, somebody is, actively, I want to say, abusing minors or taking advantage. There's a whole conversation really about what offending looks like. But I will say that, with any addiction is a progressive disease. And I think that people can, in their addiction, if it goes unchecked, if they don't get the treatment that they need, can start to seep into some form of offending behavior. That could be, spying on people, stealing people's underwear, looking in people's windows. That's offending behavior.
And that's not really far from the seemingly innocent description of, standing in the mall by the lingerie section. I mean, you're talking about, that kind of what society would deem a pervert or creepy, and I mean, is that, like, are you dealing with a lot of people that do not want to be seen as that, and therefore aren't reaching out, aren't asking for help, aren't admitting the I guess the depth of their addiction?
Yeah, we do deal with people that I think, as their disease has progressed, do start to offend in their behavior and know that it's very wrong, know that they're crossing their own ethical and moral and society's ethical and moral boundaries, and are afraid to, seek out for help. They're afraid to come forward and express that these are the kind of things that they're doing in their addiction because of the way it's seen. And, equally, it's not okay to be doing that kind of stuff. And so people need, the appropriate treatment and the appropriate guidance to understand that there are boundaries that really aren't okay to cross.
Right. I mean, I hear it often when dealing with people with addictions, the worry of being judged and, then kind of seek somewhat of a private and confidential therapy or counseling, but that in and of itself is part of the sickness, is it not? Just that, on a lighter side, even just watching my co-host Frances, just, by being raised Christian, and that it's hard to talk about. There's a discomfort there, on a very innocent level, but on a deeper level, it's how do you recover from this stigma?
I think it's going to take for society to understand the stigma is going to be difficult. It's going to take a really long time. And I think for individuals, the stigma is very difficult. And, I often say to clients that deal with sex addiction, people, when they're working through the 12 steps, when they're working their program, feel that it's important to disclose, to share what they're struggling with. And, I always say to people that it's important to be conscious of society. It's important to be conscious of the people around you and, the people that are close in your life, and how this is going to affect them and how it's going to affect the people around, and how you're going to be treated. And we talk to clients about, disclosure and how important it is, if you're in a relationship, to have a therapeutic process with your partner about the kind of behaviors that you have been doing, the kind of acting out, if there's any risk. There's risk related to sexual acting out, sexually transmitted infections. There's all sorts of stuff. But the disclosure process needs to be very carefully constructed and very carefully monitored, because the damage, related to sharing the kind of things that you have, been doing in your addiction can be great. And I think people need to be very conscious of that when sharing this kind of information.
Suzie, hi, Frances again here. Did you ever see? I've composed myself. I'm back. Did you ever see the movie Thanks for Sharing with Gwyneth Paltrow and Mark Ruffalo?
No, I didn't know.
That was a movie about 12-step sex addiction,
Right.
and so the lead character Mark had abstained from sex and all relationships for 5 years, and was trying to get back into a relationship with Gwyneth Paltrow, which is not bad. Gwyneth's pretty cute, but so would that be the normal sort of like course of recovery? Would be like abstaining for 5 years and then trying to get into a healthy relationship, where you're like talking about the fact that you struggle with this? And because in the movie he doesn't disclose that he has a sex addiction, and then she ends up finding out, and on and on. It would be hard to date. It's hard to even tell somebody that you struggle with drugs or alcohol, or like even for us, like with me and Giuseppe are both single. Darren is in a committed relationship, but for us to be in a relationship with somebody outside of recovery, it's really hard to disclose those things, and when you do it and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes if you tell someone out of the gate that these are things you struggle with, then it's just like they don't understand, so they just run or whatever, right? So what does that look like for somebody that's involved in sex addiction and in recovery for it?
Well, I think you're right. It's a landmine. It's extremely difficult. We would definitely recommend that somebody abstains from relationships and from sex for a period of time until they've reestablished their arousal template and they've started to learn and understand their own boundaries, their own triggers, the things that are difficult for them. And then, I think we would encourage, if somebody engages in a relationship, to go through a therapeutic process with their partner, and let them know what they're struggling with and the things that are difficult, and some of the boundaries that they need to hold dear to them in their recovery. The reality is that people might run. I think it's a very tricky subject, and it's a very tricky thing. We really do recommend that if somebody's in recovery, that they seek out a partner, that has the same experiences, the same ideology. So at least there is a bit of a common ground or a common understanding. But that's not always the way it's going to be.
And we've hit that topic before in addictions, because often with anything, whether it's gambling or unhealthy eating or sex or whatever it is, we always talk about, and no matter who we're talking to, it always brings up the word abstinence. Like, you must abstain from the unhealthy behavior, from the actual act itself that's causing the unmanageability and so on and so forth. And it seems like chemical dependency is, generally speaking, the one addiction that you can't kind of go back into in a moderate and healthy way, like use a little heroin on the weekends successfully it just sounds ridiculous. However, you're going to need to eat, and you're going to need to have intimate relationships and sexual encounters. I mean, that's part of life. So I think, Francis' point with the example, which is what a lot of people do in seemingly, convincingly, they're in recovery, but they're just in abstinence. They're just refraining from acting out and not making any changes. So when you say, to at some point, at someone's readiness, where there's confidence to begin a therapeutic relationship, and that's what I would define as someone in recovery that's actually working on the experience of something different that's beyond the abstinence. So the abstinence is to gain the awareness. Where is it coming from? How much control you have, what you need to let go of, and then the recovery comes in as the support, the guidance, the accountability to then participate.
I'm really find this interesting, this whole idea of an arousal template and so forth. I want to touch a little bit on the idea of so someone is building this arousal template when they're obviously probably preteen maybe. Now, how your client profile that you're seeing right now, these individuals mostly men, mostly women? Do they have a lot of trauma in their life? Is there a lot of co-occurring issues? Are most people that are sex addicts also addicted to drugs? What comes first? Tell us a little bit of what a client profile is for a sex addict.
Well, I would say that typically we see more men than women. I'm not sure whether that's I think there are more men than women that struggle with sex addiction. I think at this point it's probably a little easier for men to come forward than women. Predominantly, we see people that come forward that have a co-addiction. They're coming forward and there is drug use or alcohol use as well. Often we find that for some people, when they're using, it seems that they have they're more free, they're more confident, they're more likely to act out. Maybe they go out drinking, they find themselves using other drugs, cocaine, and then to get a better high with their cocaine use, they'll go and have a random hookup, or they'll find a prostitute. That said, sometimes the sex addiction is the predominant, and people use as a way of coping with their sexual acting out. So we typically see people come forward with multiple addictions. And I mentioned the piece about how sex activates the dopamine and people feel better. There are 3 sexual neuro pathways that are related to sex addiction. Those being arousal, numbing, and fantasy. So for the arousal template, the sex is it's a focus on erotic behavior, excitement, intensity, risk, danger. The numbing piece is where sex is used to soothe anxiety and stress. It helps somebody to sleep, remain calm. And the fantasy piece is more about obsession, preoccupation, and becoming a solution to a painful reality. Fantasy is about escaping. There's also the piece about deprivation that we hadn't touched on, the sexual anorexia. That anything erotic or sexually suggestive is rejected. So the person isn't sexually acting out; they're sexually acting in. Now, with those kind of
I think that's being a Christian. I'm just kidding. Just joking.
Yeah. So, with those neuro pathways, there does appear to be a lot of trauma related to the arousal piece, the arousal template, the numbing, the fantasy. I think that's the piece that's a little bit confused, that this compulsive sexual behavior really is a trauma response, a stress response, a way of avoiding grief, pain, anxiety, which is something that when we're working with people, we really do look at the trauma and help people to understand the trauma piece. And I think if you can help somebody to heal from their trauma, then the hope is that sex then becomes more normalized, and they're not looking to they're not using sex as a way of reducing the trauma or grief or pain. It's more of a pleasurable, intimate experience with somebody.
Well, it's definitely something that needs to be spoken more about. I mean, I work at Last Door, and I've experienced a lot of different treatment modalities at different centers. I've been to a lot of conferences. That's how you and I actually met, was at addiction conferences. I mean, do you agree with me when no one talks about this? I mean, there's so many men and women going to treatment, and I guarantee you, I don't know what the numbers are because I don't think anyone's even cared to look, but I would say 95% of all these individuals, the last time they were using was probably based around some kind of sexual experience, either by themselves or with other people. And then you go to treatment and all you talk about is your heroin addiction or your coke addiction or your alcohol addiction, and that's it. And trying to find a sex therapist is very difficult. I mean, it's you can't even find them. There's no one really practicing in it, but you want to find someone to help you with your heroin addiction, and there's hundreds of people as soon as you go into Google. So what are you finding in the industry? Like, why did you get into this? Because this is fairly new for you too. Do you think we're doing the service for Canadians in this country for sexual addiction, or do you think we're like miles behind?
I think we're behind, and, I'll sort of tell you a little bit about my own kind of journey into this. Like so many people, I really didn't think that I wanted to work in sex addiction because, like so many others, it seemed scary. It seemed... I really struggled with the concept of what sex addiction was, how that linked with, abuse, offending, and I wasn't sure that I, really wanted to go there because I felt that it was going to really challenge some of my own beliefs and the way I felt about certain things. And it was at a conference that I heard Dr. Patrick Carnes talk about sex addiction and trauma. And it really opened my eyes. And I thought, wow, you know what? That's something that I think I should look into. And I started doing the training. And honestly, the training really challenged me on a personal and a professional level. It really got me to think about stuff that I'd never really considered, or that I was too shy or embarrassed or uncomfortable about thinking about. And it was a challenge. It was a really difficult thing. I know that we really don't treat sex addiction right now the way we should or could. I know that in the professional field, most people feel that they don't want to go there. And it's so misunderstood. We run a group every other Tuesday for men struggling with sex addiction. And I think what strikes me every week is the level of pain that the men in this group are experiencing, the shame, the helplessness. It's so sad. I mean, it really is. It's such a difficult thing to struggle with, to deal with, to learn how to manage. There's so much trauma related to it. And I think we could be doing much more. And you're right. I mean, I don't know that Canada is quite on a par with the States in terms of what we're doing. We're trying. And I know that right now I'm the only person in Calgary that's running this kind of group. And I'm thrilled that I have the privilege to be able to try and do something like this and meet some of these gentlemen, because it's such a phenomenal process. If you can really support people and you can open their eyes to the fact that, they're struggling with addiction, and that it's, something that is so secretive, and that it's, like any addiction, it's unmanageable. It's out of control for them. And to help them to gain some perspective around that, it's such a neat process.
For our listeners right now, we're in Vancouver, you're in Calgary. they have a loved one that they think has a problem, or there's a sponsor out there that has a sponsee that keeps relapsing with hookers. The scenarios are probably endless. What do you what do you suggest they do? Do you suggest they pick up a book, they go to SA? What's some of the top 3 things they could do tomorrow or today?
I think they could definitely, and this kind of sounds ironic, but look online. I was challenged with that because obviously a lot of people, online is what gets them into trouble. But there's Recovery Canada, which is a great resource for people. Dr. Patrick Carnes' website really talks about, sex addiction. They can Google, they can go to an SAA or an SA meeting. And they can reach out. There are many people that are struggling with this. It's just a case of, reaching out, taking a risk. Pick up the phone and call us and, see if we can't connect you with somebody, bring you in and just give you a chance to, to debrief, and maybe get a little bit of direction and help with something that, most people feel that they can't ask for help around.
Hi, Dr. LeBrock. Sorry. Hi, Francis again. Full of questions over here. So I'm curious. I pretty much stay away from relationships because I now sort of associate them with pain. It's like you're learning a lot about me, but anyhow.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So after a while, do people that you help in the groups and whatever, do they tend to do that? Like, I mean, honestly, the last relationship I was in, I was like, I'm never doing that again. And it was probably like one of the healthier relationships that I've had, but they all end in pain. And personally, like, I think, what a waste of time. Because you put yourself out there and all that kind of stuff. So I could only imagine if you're putting yourself out there with, sex addiction and all the rest of it, and opening yourself up and allowing yourself to be seen, and then the person, it doesn't work out or whatever. Like, after a while, do people that struggle with this, do they decide just to stay abstinent and to get on with life without sex and without relationships and all that?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mentioned the word anorexia before. If you look at a coin, on the one side you've got sex addiction, which is, acting out in your sexual behavior. And then on the flip side, you've got, sexual anorexia, which is the extreme opposite. And so often with addiction, we see such black and white, extreme behavior. Somebody that refrains from any kind of relationship, they remain isolated, lonely, they restrict their emotions, they distrust any romantic feelings, any instinct. I think sometimes people are so fearful of the pain related to relationships and sex and intimacy that they go completely the other way. And in any recovery process, I think it's teaching people balance and helping people understand that there can be balance in relationships, there can be balance in intimacy. And it's finding that, and it's finding your way through the pain, the mistrust, and learning to do things in a healthy way, which so often, we don't know how to do that in recovery.
Thank you so much for being on our show today. Definitely a great conversation about sex addiction and recovery. How can someone get in touch with you? What's your website address?
Our website is